Ever wondered what happens when a politician is prepared down to the last detail while their opponent relies on empty talking points? Watch closely as Jasmine Crockett dismantles Greg Abbott's arguments with precision, facts, and empathy, leaving viewers stunned and redefining political accountability in Texas forever. In a heated press room in Austin, Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium with a calm yet commanding presence. The air was thick with anticipation, reporters whispering among themselves, microphones poised to capture every word. Crockett's unexpected move that day would not just challenge the narrative of Governor Greg Abbott, would shift the entire argument surrounding Texas' recent policy decisions. What began as a routine Q&A session quickly morphed into a political masterclass in strategy and precision. Abbott had been touting his administration's achievements on infrastructure and public safety, claiming progress in areas that Texans had grown increasingly skeptical about. Crockett, however, had come prepared. She opened her address by highlighting specific failures in Abbott's policies, citing concrete statistics on rural hospital closures and the skyrocketing costs of healthcare in small towns. The data was unassailable, drawn from state reports and verified studies, leaving reporters nodding and scribbling furiously, instead of immediately attacking. Crockett framed her intervention around the human consequences of policy missteps. She recounted stories of families forced to drive hours to reach the nearest hospital, the growing instances of untreated medical emergencies, and the local leaders who had repeatedly warned state officials but were ignored. This human-centered approach made Abbott's talking points appear hollow, and it allowed Crockett to establish moral authority in the debate. Then came her unexpected pivot, a question that caught Abbott off guard. Without hesitation, she asked, "Governor, how do you reconcile celebrating economic growth while your policies are directly shutting down critical healthcare facilities in rural counties?" The room fell silent. For a brief moment, Abbott seemed momentarily disoriented, fumbling through prepared remarks that now felt inadequate. Crockett's ability to pivot from critique to a pointed question exemplified her political instincts. She wasn't merely responding. She was dictating the flow of the discussion. As Abbott tried to regain control, Crockett didn't relent. She shifted focus to the broader political consequences, connecting these administrative failures to potential voter disillusionment and declining confidence in state leadership. Her words were measured but firm, emphasizing that policies have consequences that extend beyond press releases or staged announcements. Every phrase she used was designed to challenge the governor while maintaining a professional tone that could not easily be dismissed by the press or public. The press cameras caught every micro-expression. Abbott's eyes darted to aides for support, and a faint crease of frustration appeared on his forehead. Crockett's confidence was unshakable, her delivery methodical yet natural. It was clear to everyone in the room that she was not improvising. This was strategy in motion. Her unexpected move was not a mere rhetorical flourish. It was a calculated effort to highlight contradictions and force Abbott into a defensive position in front of a national audience. By the time the first 10 minutes had passed, Crockett had already reframed the debate. What had started as a discussion about policy achievements became a public reckoning of accountability. Reporters whispered to one another, comparing notes, realizing that the narrative they had anticipated, another Abbott press highlight, had been completely appended. Crockett had turned a standard political briefing into a moment of viral potential, and her mastery over timing, tone, and content was evident in every word she spoke. As the hearing progressed, Jasmine Crockett didn't just stick to scripted rebuttals or standard talking points. She recalibrated the conversation entirely. Greg Abbott, accustomed to rehearsed political defenses, suddenly found himself on unsteady ground. Crockett's approach wasn't aggressive in the typical sense. It was precise, data-driven, and timed with a rare sense of political theater that amplified every point she made. It began with her acknowledgement of the routine spin that usually accompanies Republican statements on voter engagement. Abbott, maintaining his typical composure, attempted to present the redistricting victories as a triumph of governance. Yet, Crockett's carefully curated evidence highlighting voter suppression reports, demographic discrepancies, and overlooked rural challenges interrupted the narrative with razor-sharp clarity. Unlike other politicians who resort to rapid-fire talking points, she allowed the facts to speak for themselves, letting the weight of the numbers and historical trends underscore her argument. Her pivot to Texas rural hospital closures was particularly effective. Abbott, aiming to highlight state-level healthcare initiatives, was quickly overshadowed as Crockett contrasted those claims with the on-the-ground reality. She detailed how closures had disproportionately affected low-income communities, creating literal gaps in access to emergency care. Using publicly available data and anecdotal testimonies from affected residents, Crockett illustrated the cascading consequences that policies often fail to capture. The room comprising lawmakers, press members, and political analysts witnessed her ability to transform abstract statistics into immediate, relatable human consequences. The next move shifted the lens to gun violence, a politically charged and emotionally resonant topic. Crockett framed her argument around systemic failures, how state enforcement policies, legislative inaction, and political posturing collectively left communities exposed. Abbott attempted to counter with standard crime reduction metrics, but Crockett punctured the veneer of reassurance by juxtaposing statistical claims with localized incidents. Each example she delivered was meticulously sourced, leaving little room for rebuttal. The precision of her delivery made the discrepancy between reported outcomes and lived experiences impossible to ignore. Crockett's strategy was not just to highlight failures, but to anticipate defenses. She seamlessly wove in preemptive counters to Abbott's expected narratives on taxation, energy policies, and Trump-era tariffs, by integrating policy critique with empathetic storytelling. She created a framework where Abbott's responses appeared reactive rather than proactive. This psychological edge was subtle but effective. Each of her statements forced Abbott to respond to the narrative she had carefully established, not the one he wished to convey. A particularly striking moment came when she addressed voter suppression. Rather than the conventional broad critique, Crockett focused on granular examples of procedural barriers, irregularities in mail-in ballot distribution, and the disenfranchisement of historically underrepresented communities. She tied these issues directly to upcoming electoral projections, demonstrating how seemingly minor administrative decisions could cascade into substantial political consequences. It was a masterclass in connecting policy minutiae to electoral strategy, and it left many analysts in the room recalculating the perceived strength of Abbott's redistricting arguments. The exchange also highlighted Crockett's rhetorical discipline. She balanced assertiveness with composure, refusing to escalate into theatrics while maintaining undeniable authority. Every point was anchored with sources, public records, local news reports, and first-hand accounts. The cadence of her delivery pauses at strategic moments. Measured emphasis on key phrases amplified the impact without seeming contrived. Political observers noted that the pacing alone turned standard fact-sharing into a dynamic presentation that drew attention not only to the content but to her control of the room. By the halfway mark, Abbott's attempts to redirect the discussion were increasingly tenuous. Every pivot he tried, whether toward economic growth, narratives, or general claims of governance, was met with carefully constructed counters that reminded the audience of the broader systemic failures. Crockett's approach exemplified a rare combination: mastery of data, command of narrative, and the ability to make complex policy issues instantly comprehensible. The effect was almost cinematic. What could have been a routine political exchange turned into a staged exposure of contradictions and selective reporting. The crescendo of her argument came as she bridged these issues to long-term implications for Texas politics. She outlined potential electoral consequences, shifts in public opinion, and the strategic leverage that communities now wield. By framing Abbott's victories as not unassailable, but susceptible to voter mobilization and scrutiny, she reframed the conversation entirely. Observers noted that this pivot wasn't just a critique, it was a strategic repositioning, turning Abbott's perceived strengths into vulnerabilities in real time. Throughout the session, Crockett demonstrated that political skill is not merely in responding to attacks, but in controlling the narrative arc. Her unexpected move, grounded in research, local impact, and a keen sense of timing, did not simply challenge Abbott. It shifted the debate to her terms. Every data point, anecdote, and measured rebuttal contributed to a crescendo that left the opposition scrambling to reassert control. Analysts would later point to this segment as a blueprint for effective, modern political engagement: fact-driven, emotionally intelligent, and dynamically adaptive. As the hearing concluded, the room's energy had palpably shifted. Journalists and analysts would describe the session as redefining the conversation and setting a new standard for accountability in political hearings. Crockett's methodical yet assertive approach, culminating in this unexpected strategic move, underscored why she's considered a rising force in Texas politics. She didn't just answer Abbott's points. She reframed the dialogue in ways that could influence not only immediate perception, but the broader political landscape for months to come. As the hearing progressed into its third phase, Jasmine Crockett intensified her focus on the deeper structural and policy issues that Abbott hoped would remain obscured. She wasn't merely debating points, she was reconstructing the narrative entirely. The pivot to Texas economic disparities and the hidden consequences of statewide policies was subtle yet devastating. Abbott, attempting to assert authority, found his rehearsed talking points increasingly undermined by Crockett's meticulous dissection of facts, timelines, and local impacts. Crockett began by highlighting the overlooked consequences of Abbott's tax policies on small businesses, particularly in rural areas. While Abbott emphasized state-level growth metrics, she brought the conversation back to individuals, the shop owners, farmers, and workers whose livelihoods had been directly affected. She combined statistical evidence with personal stories, giving each policy a human face. The juxtaposition was stark. The same figures Abbott touted as achievements contrasted sharply with localized hardships that painted a far less flattering picture. Gun violence returned as a recurring theme, but Crockett elevated the discussion with fresh insights. She didn't merely cite incident counts. She examined legislative gaps, funding deficits for law enforcement in high-risk areas, and the downstream effects on public safety perceptions. Abbott attempted to counter with his administration's initiatives, but Crockett's strategy was precise: acknowledge the effort, then demonstrate the measurable shortcomings. This technique made Abbott appear reactive, constantly on the defensive, while she maintained a commanding presence. Another critical moment came when she dissected healthcare access in Texas. Rather than general statements about statewide facilities, Crockett zeroed in on rural hospital closures, showing maps, timelines, and demographic implications. She outlined how these closures disproportionately affected low-income and minority populations, linking policy choices to real-world outcomes. By contextualizing these closures within broader systemic inequities, she transformed a seemingly technical policy discussion into a compelling narrative on fairness, access, and accountability. Crockett's rhetorical approach continued to blend evidence with psychological acuity. Every question Abbott raised was anticipated and reframed to highlight gaps or contradictions. Her tone remained measured, calm, but insistent, never descending into theatrics, yet commanding attention through clarity and precision. Political commentators would later highlight her pause and pivot strategy: short, deliberate pauses before delivering key facts that forced both Abbott and the audience to confront the weight of her evidence. She also turned attention to voter suppression, a subject Abbott had hoped to gloss over. Crockett illustrated how procedural barriers, selective policy enforcement, and uneven access to ballot information created tangible inequities in voter participation. By connecting these procedural issues to electoral implications, she framed them not as abstract complaints, but as real threats to democratic integrity. This strategic alignment of policy, critique, and electoral consequence caught many observers off guard, highlighting her ability to integrate legal, social, and political dimensions seamlessly. Midway through the hearing, Crockett introduced a series of comparisons between Abbott's public statements and documented outcomes. Each point was precise. Dates, reports, and sources were cited in real time, forcing Abbott to either confront contradictions or allow them to remain unchallenged. The effect was cumulative. What could have been a routine political rebuttal became a methodical unraveling of the opposing narrative. Analysts would later note how her pacing and evidence selection created a mounting pressure effect, each successive point amplifying the impact of the previous. Her command of political optics became increasingly evident. Crockett balanced the immediacy of live debate with strategic foresight, ensuring that each assertion would resonate beyond the room. Her references to local constituents, media coverage, and historical precedent reinforced her authority, while subtly positioning Abbott's responses as reactive or evasive. This careful calibration demonstrated not just mastery of policy, but a nuanced understanding of perception, public opinion, and political theater. Crockett also used framing techniques to her advantage, by consistently linking Abbott's wins to broader systemic costs. She transformed what might have been perceived as neutral achievements into points of critique. For instance, when Abbott highlighted job growth metrics, she juxtaposed them with regional income stagnation, rising living costs, and the closing of essential services. These comparisons were visually supported through slides, infographics, and narrative transitions, all of which underscored her analytical depth while maintaining audience engagement. By the end of this session, it was clear that Crockett had shifted the narrative entirely. Abbott's focus on victory and political optics was replaced by scrutiny of consequences, community impacts, and accountability. The strategic move that defined this hearing, the combination of precise evidence, humanized storytelling, and rhetorical timing, demonstrated why Crockett is regarded as a rising force in Texas politics. Observers would later describe this segment as a turning point, where preparation, insight, clarity coalesced to redefine how political hearings could influence both public perception and strategic outcomes. Jasmine Crockett's strategy throughout the confrontation with Greg Abbott had already shifted the narrative in ways few expected. But it was in the closing moments that her approach truly crystallized. Abbott, accustomed to scripted responses and predictable talking points, found himself on unstable ground as Crockett seamlessly tied policy outcomes to real human consequences. Every line she delivered cut through generic political rhetoric, highlighting the tangible impacts of Abbott's administration on healthcare access, education, and public safety across Texas. The atmosphere in the room changed perceptibly. Journalists, political analysts, and staffers all leaned forward, sensing the weight of Crockett's words. She methodically cited recent reports on rural hospital closures, linking them to preventable tragedies, and contrasted these with state budget allocations that favored high-profile projects over the needs of underserved communities. Abbott, whose confidence had seemed unshakable at the beginning, struggled to interject without appearing defensive. Each interruption he attempted was countered with precise facts and a calm, unwavering tone that left no room for deflection. What made this exchange remarkable was Crockett's ability to maintain a balance between assertiveness and clarity. She didn't resort to theatrics or personal attacks. Instead, she leveraged policy, expertise, and empathy. She referenced voter suppression statistics in districts most affected by redistricting, demonstrating how the combination of political maneuvering and policy neglect directly harmed the people Abbott claimed to represent. This wasn't about scoring points, this was a meticulous demonstration of accountability. Abbott tried several times to pivot the discussion toward broader economic achievements, but Crockett anticipated these moves. She had prepared a narrative that tied economic metrics to real-world outcomes, questioning how growth figures translated into lives saved, schools funded, or families supported. Every claim Abbott made was met with data-driven counterpoints that illuminated gaps between political messaging and societal impact. Viewers following live streams and social media clips quickly noticed the contrast, leading to viral commentary, praising Crockett's disciplined articulation and preparedness. The exchange also highlighted Crockett's skill in framing the conversation for maximum clarity. She segmented complex issues, healthcare, gun safety, education, and voter rights into digestible, evidence-based narratives that allowed even casual viewers to understand the stakes. Her pacing ensured that each point landed with impact, while Abbott's responses increasingly seemed reactive rather than proactive. Analysts later noted that the political environment was rarely this transparent. Most debates are controlled by talking points and sound bites, but Crockett's approach bypassed the usual performative elements and connected directly with the audience. As the discussion progressed, Crockett introduced human stories to reinforce statistical arguments. She described case studies of families affected by hospital closures, students deprived of essential resources, and communities disenfranchised by manipulative redistricting. By putting faces and experiences behind abstract policies, she made Abbott's defenses appear cold and detached. It became evident that the public perception was shifting. Crockett was no longer simply critiquing Abbott. She was actively defining the narrative, framing him as out of touch with the lived realities of Texans. The final segment of the exchange saw Crockett deliver a summary that was as precise as it was powerful. She outlined the cumulative effects of policies and administrative decisions, emphasizing both immediate consequences and long-term risks for state governance. Abbott's attempts to respond were increasingly fragmented. The coherence and focus of Crockett's delivery highlighted the contrast sharply. Media commentators later described this moment as a turning point, noting that Crockett didn't merely counter arguments. She set a benchmark for political accountability. By the time the exchange concluded, it was clear that the discussion had reached an inflection point. Social media platforms exploded with clips highlighting key lines, analysis threads disassembling Abbott's failed counters, and opinion pieces framing Crockett's approach as a model of effective political communication. Across Texas, voters expressed newfound clarity on issues previously obscured by partisan rhetoric. Crockett's mastery lay in turning a public confrontation into a multidimensional lesson on policy, empathy, and civic responsibility without ever stepping outside professional decorum. For political strategists, the implications were immediate. Crockett demonstrated that preparation, fact-based articulation, and human-centered storytelling could decisively shape public perception, even against seasoned opponents. This confrontation illustrated the power of combining policy literacy with communication precision, a combination that not only held Abbott accountable but also inspired constituents to critically evaluate political narratives themselves. Ultimately, Crockett's handling of the exchange transcended a single debate. It became a case study in political clarity and public engagement, showing that sustained preparation and thoughtful presentation could achieve results that traditional rhetoric often fails to deliver. Her ability to navigate pressure, maintain composure, and strategically highlight discrepancies in Abbott's record made this moment resonate far beyond the walls of the room, echoing in newsrooms, social media feeds, and public discourse across the state.